So I've been spending my day wandering around Lexington a little bit, trying to get a little bit more of a handle of the city. Figured I'd settle down here, maybe drop an album review. What that Royal Blood record that came out earlier?
Just look like you know. Look like you know something I should. I think I should know. I really feel like you want me to. Don't say that you want me. Don't pray the wish you can't make come true.
Look, I've always thought Royal Blood's formula, while they have a number of catchy melodies, can feel a tad bit stale with just bass and drums. Good grooves, sure, but you need to do a little bit more with that in order to develop the formula. Unfortunately, they tried to do that on this sophomore record, and it feels like they're just ripping off Queens of the Stone Age or Jack White wholesale, or at least doing a sound that those other two groups will do better. And when you couple it with the fact that our frontman really should not be using as much falsetto as he is, and that the writing can feel, unfortunately, a tad bit formulaic when it comes to this brand of hard rock and somewhat blues rock inspired textures, look, it's not bad. A couple good melodies, but there needs to be a little bit more to it, at least for me. I'm thinking a 6 out of 10. So I'm here in Triangle Park in downtown Lexington, and okay, it's pretty. Still not a lot of people walking around. It's more of a driving city from what I can tell. Anyway, figured to knock out one more review. How about that Mother record that came out way back in like February of this year?
I've got my love stuck in my soul, in my throat. I let my love out in the cold, in the cold. I've got to give my love to my soul. I've got to give my love to my soul and let go.
And here's the thing, you probably haven't heard of this band unless you're deep into Canadian indie rock, but even if you had heard them, I would understand if you didn't like them. Imagine a cross between all the quirkiness of the B-52s with a bunch of the elements tied in from the New Pornographers, or at least trying to rip the New Pornographers off, except with none of the good vocal harmonies and none of the brains. Yeah, I'm not really a fan of this band, and when I heard that they were teaming up with the producer from Headley on their newest mainstream release, I had some bad feelings, and yet I wanted to hate this album, and I just can't. It's not that bad. Yeah, the vocals are still kind of annoying, the lyrics are absolutely asinine, but in getting a little brawnier and getting a little bit heavier, they actually turned in a halfway decent record that I actually found more songs on this than I liked than I didn't. Yeah, I'm as surprised as anyone. So, very light 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious. I don't know if it's an entry point, because again, I'm not really a huge fan of the band, but I tolerated this. Not bad. So you know, I keep on saying that Lexington might be more of a driving town than a walking city. I'll give you an example of why I might think that. See, over there, that is their version of the distillery district. A lot of their distilleries are scattered around a lot of the city, a couple miles outside of town, but they actually supposedly have a few down over there, and yet there's barely any sidewalks. There's barely an opportunity for people to walk around and experience this side of the city. And considering that whiskey and bourbon specifically is supposed to be such a huge Kentucky thing, you'd think there'd be more of an emphasis on driving it as a tourist trap compared to the distillery district that we have in Toronto, for a prime example. It draws in a lot of people. And honestly, from what I've seen in the city, it could use a little bit more of that tourist inflection coming on right now. But that's ultimately City Council's choice for them. So let's talk about an album of some sort. How about that Mew record that dropped earlier this year, Visuals?
Close your eyes haphazardly upon the bed to dream. Even when you were right, you were wrong. It don't matter to me. Even when you were right, you were wrong. It don't matter to me.
It's more of a progressive pop rock record. They've been around since the mid-2000s, and they actually put out some quality work down there. So how are they going to come back after a couple of years minus their lead guitarist? Well, it does kind of hurt them when they try to get a little bit heavier. It just feels forced, and I'm not exactly wild about some of the higher pitched vocals. And the lyrics can feel awfully breezy if they're describing some sort of relationship, although you can make the central argument that they were somewhat referring to the band and the relationship was a bit of a metaphor. It's been done before. I don't know, there are good songs on this, but at the same time, it's probably not a good thing that I'm covering this record so close to as when I covered Steven Wilson's To the Bone, which takes a lot of similar approach to this sort of pop rock, and it might not be as progressive as what Mew tries here, at least at certain points, but the tunes are a lot better, and I ultimately fall back on that. Still, couple good songs, so I'm gonna give this a solid 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious, if you're a fan, although I gotta be honest, they have done better in the past. And on the topic of more progressive leaning acts that I probably shouldn't be covering right now. And so, after a pretty long day, why not we do that, talk about that Grizzly Bear album finally, because I actually do have a fair amount to say about this record. And fair warning, you might not like all of it, especially if you're a die-hard Grizzly Bear fan.
To the sound of distant shots and passing trucks, we walk with the morning sound. It's the sound of distant shots and passing trucks.
See, I came to this band fairly late. I fully went through their entire discography in preparation for this review, and you know what? They're not a bad band. I completely see the appeal of a lot of their sounds, but as a whole, maybe they're just not for me. I find a lot of their lack of serious song structures and overall groove, especially in their earlier albums, kind of hurt them. They went for a little bit more of an ethereal feel midway through, and I can kind of appreciate that. Started bringing in more rock textures by the time we got Shields. And you know what? They're not bad, but I rarely found that the lyrics came together as much as I would otherwise like. I found a lot of the vocal harmonies good and engaging, but the compositions, for as heavily inspired by Animal Collective as they were, they never quite coalesced into solid enough hooks that I would otherwise like or go back to. I think every Grizzly Bear album requires a lot of listens to really appreciate, and again, I do appreciate them, but at the same time, I could go back to, let's say, a Panda Bear record, or even better, a case like a Fleet Foxes album, and I would find a lot more in terms of structure and cohesive messaging that I thought resonate with me a lot better. Maybe I'm just spoiled by having a lot of these bands come later in the playground that Grizzly Bear helped create in the 2000s. I can admit that. So then with this comeback album, you know what? As different as this record is in comparison with a lot of their discography, emphasizing more synthesizers, a little bit harsher grooves, slightly sharper guitars, it's still very much a Grizzly Bear album in that I like it, I appreciate it, but I wouldn't quite put it among their best, and I wouldn't say it's a record that totally works for me. I like a lot of the vocal harmonies. For as much as we get them, they're not quite as layered as they normally are, and at the same time, some of the synthesizer choices they use, I get the reason why they're used, but come on, they could do better than some of the cases like what they put on Aquarian. It's just not a tone that connects for me, even though, again, I like some of the more driving grooves here. And at the same time, by the usage of some of those harsher tones, you don't quite get the same swells of elegance and power that made some of their earlier records so inspiring, so immediately distinctive. That organic element has been pushed back a little bit, and I think that kind of hurts some of their instrumentation overall. Now, when it comes to the content, fair warning, it's a Grizzly Bear album, so interpreting most of these lyrics that feel more impressionistic, even though they're trying to write more established, almost borderline pop songs, you're still not going to get much of a narrative that coalesces through these songs. But I think I was able to parse certain things together. And the one thing that you've seen emphasized in several reviews, that it's more of a breakup album. You can see elements of that internal struggle, but even the band has somewhat rejected this. Ed Drouse has said that in some of his interviews, and I actually kind of agree with him. A lot of these lyrics are more focused on setting a scene of chaos or uncontrolled paths that you might not entirely understand, but at the same time you want to understand. There still is that yearning that is at the core of so much of Grizzly Bear's themes, and I definitely like and appreciate that. There is still some element of earnestness, it's just tempered with the maturity to realize that you cannot control all ends. You could almost say that it's somewhat detachment in an embracing of that element of being able to step back, trying not to control or, in some cases, manhandle the situation, especially when it comes to relationships. And I think there's an element to that, but it's not a record that's embracing detachment per se, so much as it is a record of recognizing you can't control people in the same way. And sometimes it might make sense to step back, take a breath, let time progress as it may. Acknowledge your flaws. Acknowledge how time has changed you, but at the same time, there's still an option for you to try all the same. Maybe just not in a way that it's just going to consume you. Although I will say the album ends on a bit of a downer note, where basically he sees time's ravages as a past and is forced to take a step back and realize that that is all that is being left before him as his soul ventures further onwards. Which is kind of true when you consider what people is left of them once we die and we pass up into that grand sky. But at the same time, I think there is something there in terms of acknowledging and accepting detachment from these emotional scenes, especially coming in the aftermath of a separation, taking ownership of what you're coming through, realizing what you may have done wrong, and taking responsibility for it. I think there is a core to this record that I do like and respect. I just wish it came together into more songs that I otherwise liked. A lot of the production is still gorgeous. You expect that on a Grizzly Bear record, but at the same time, I'm still not gravitating to the songs in the same way. Maybe I was spoiled by an already pretty terrific progressive pop rock record from Steven Wilson. I can admit that. And you know what? From that point of view, I will say in terms of more of this progressive chamber folk art pop sort of fusion, I think Grizzly Bear pulled it off pretty well. It's a decent record, definitely something I would go back to encompass that, a lot of that atmosphere. Just not something I would ever really embrace in the same way, which is pretty much what I would say for any Grizzly Bear album. So I'm thinking solid 7 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious. I guarantee fans will probably like it, especially if they're more on board with some of the synthesizer tones, which I think are somewhat hit and miss, but overall the grooves do compensate. But yeah, check it out. It's worth seeing. Till then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse. I'm coming up from Nashville next, and I'll see you next time.